Ashley. I am going to be doing my presentation today on physical abuse in children. All right. So, what is physical abuse in children? It is the intentional or recklessly doing of any of the following things below. So, causing bodily injury to a child, creating a reasonably likelihood of physical injury, kicking, throwing, biting, stabbing, burning, or cutting a child, which endangers them, forcibly shaking or slapping the child who is under the age of 1, interfering with the child's breathing, and also an unreasonable restraining of the child. So, all of these things would be things that would classify physical abuse in children in the state of Pennsylvania. I got all of these things for my definition from the Pennsylvania Child Protective Services law in order to make sure that I knew exactly what physical abuse was considered in the state of Pennsylvania. So some statistics about physical abuse. There are about 4.1 million reports of physical abuse made each year. These statistics are from 2016, so I should clarify there was 401 million reports in the year of 2016. 7.4 million of those reports were children who 18.2% of the victims were physically abused. And then 44.2% of the children who were reported to be receiving physical abuse, they died due to the abuse that they endured. So of that, 49.4% were under the age of 1. And then physical abuse is the second most common type of abuse that children encounter. And about 78% of reports of abuse are physical abuse. Something that really stuck out to me was that 49.4% of children who experience physical abuse are under the age of 1. So a lot of these kiddos who are experiencing this physical abuse are under the age of 1, and they're still babies, still infants. So that was really shocking to me. So just some more information about statistics. I found these charts to be really interesting. So child victims served by age, so it just kind of breaks down the ages there. Again, you can see that the 0 to 6 age was a pretty big chunk. The 7 to 12 age was also really pretty big. And then the 13 to 17 age range was the smaller one of the two. So people who were investigated by age, so this would be the individuals who that were investigated for the abuse. So 10% of them were under the age of 13. 13 to 17 years of age was 13%, and then 18 years or older was 77% of individuals. So a lot of these people are over the age of 18 who are engaging in the abuse, but it does also happen by individuals who are not adults. And then as far as the relationship to the victim, about 51% of them were relatives of the child, and then about 39% of them were a parent. 39% of them, the individuals, the abusers, were a parent. And then only a small portion, about 10%, were unknown to the individual. So some possible causes of child abuse, when looking at things in terms of the microsystem, there's child and parent interactions would be that microsystem. So a lot of times the parents have decided that the child is difficult. The child places a stress on the parent, which results in them punishing the child. And then terms causing more parental stress. Also, things like prior abuse of the parents when they were children is also a big factor that impacts whether or not they are abusive towards their children. When looking at things in terms of the mesosystem, these would be like networks which the parent and child are involved in. So like their relationships with others or agencies that they're involved in. It could also include like poverty and unemployment, or the fact that the family is constantly moving. All of them are things that impact the stress level of the parents and of the child. Parents also at times have been reporting that they feel they are lacking the resources that they need in order to be successful parents, where they feel as though they are disconnected from others around them, so they're not really sure how to handle their children, which in terms leads to them abusing their child because they, again, going back to the micro portion, their child is acting out or being difficult. They're having a hard time controlling their child, so they become stressed and they don't really have anywhere to turn to or someone to talk to be like, hey, how can I handle this behavior? So they tend to engage in that physical abuse towards their child. It's not all of the time, but it is a factor which could impact abuse. Also is the macro system. So this is like how the micro and meso systems are situated together. So this would be the cultural variables. So in different cultures, they may handle punishment of a child differently than another culture. And I know that there are various cultures which look at abuse and like hitting or spanking your child as appropriate form of punishment for that child. So things like that also have a big impact on child abuse. Some symptoms of physical abuse in children, the most obvious one would be bruises, but a lot of times these bruises are hidden from view and covered by clothing. There also could be a pattern in the bruise. So something that would look like a hanger or a handprint even would be indicators of a bruising from abuse. Another factor would be fractures. A lot of times when the doctors are evaluating a fracture on a child, the explanations of the parents don't fit the injury. So the parents will say, oh, well, this happened, he fell down the steps or whatever, but the injury that the child has does not match them falling down the steps. Radiologists are able to determine the number of fractures that a child has had based upon the calcium deposits around the fracture. So they can tell if this child has had several different fractures, it might be indication that there is some type of abuse going on for this child. Head and internal injuries, this would be like skull fractures. They typically are going to indicate that the individual experienced a blow to the head. Some other type of injuries to their abdomen, so typically it tends to be their liver or spleen, some type of intestinal injury, kidney or bladder injuries, torn arteries, or an injury to their pancreas. A lot of times if the child has an injury to one of those organs, it is an indicator that the child may have encountered some physical abuse. Another type of physical abuse would be burns. It could be cigarette burns, which are typically found on the abdomen, feet, or genitals of children. Wood burning stove is another common burn that children who are experiencing abuse have. This is typically on their feet, hands, or buttocks, and then water as well. And typically when it comes to hot water, you'll see like a zebra pattern in the burn. There was a picture that I had seen where the child had like a zebra print on their stomach and then their butt had like a donut circle around it. So typically when the child is being immersed in that hot water, they're like crunched up in a ball and they're being submerged down into the water. So their bottom is hitting the bottom of the pan, the bucket, whatever they're being submerged in. And that's why there's a circle there. And that's why that would explain the zebra markings on their stomach, because their stomach's crouched up. The next slide I'm going to show briefly, but I do want to give you a warning that it does have some pictures that are hard to see. I just felt the need to put this in because I feel like a lot of times this is how it looks when a child is exhibiting abuse. So you can see here the burns. This is the head fracture. Here's another fracture with an individual's bones, and then here is some other thing, another picture of bruising to kind of show you how it has the different patterns. Some symptoms of physical abuse. So a lot of times the children will engage in crying, but there is a difference in their normal type of crying and like during the normal examination process, and then when they're being examined by the doctors, it's very different type of crying. They also are like watchful of others when they cry. So an infant might like look around at what the other children are crying at almost in fear. They also could exhibit like really high-pitched cry. Um, they have passivity towards schoolwork as well as in play with other children and toys. So they also have a lot of negative peer interactions and peer relationships. They tend to seem old for their age and as though they're unable to enjoy life. So typically these kids are individuals who just seem like miserable or like they're the adult um, in school. And you can usually tell by how they're acting. You just feel like the way that they talk or the way that they interact is more of like older for their age. Um, have an inability, sometimes they may have an inability to control their bladder or their bowel movements. They may engage in temper tantrums or just some bizarre behaviors. They may be withdrawn, have very low self-esteem and lack confidence, and also have afraid of failure and disappointing others. And I think that one is kind of self-explanatory in a way because these children, I'm sure anytime that they're doing something wrong, they are being beat. So that fear of failing or disappointing others would be a big thing for them. Some effects of physical abuse would be those poor peer relationships. So as I mentioned earlier, they don't really have a lot of friends. They have peer rejection. Peers don't really want to be around them. Or they might have negative choices with their associated peers. So the peers that they hang out with are not really positive role models and not really like a good individual for them to hang out with. Sometimes they're viewed as mean, starting fights, and non-cooperative. So the peers just don't really like some of these kiddos that are experiencing this physical abuse. They also may exhibit some anxiety and depression. Again, that fear of failing or upsetting others is huge in them. Not wanting to get things right, or wrong, I'm sorry, at school, wanting to always be perfect and get everything right. Not wanting to upset anyone and like an overreaction when they upset you. It may have a really low self-esteem and a low self-confidence would be also things that they would show. So some history of the child welfare system. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's kind of led us to where we are today as far as how physical abuse is handled. So in 1809, a shopkeeper was convicted of assaulting a 3-year-old girl and her mother. That kind of started the whole process. In 1874, we had the Mary Ellen case. She was 9 years old and was routinely beaten by her guardians. She had Wheeler, who helped recruit the help of a guy who was in charge of the prevention to cruelty for animals, as well as his attorney, and they helped to get Mary Ellen removed from her home. In 1874, New York started the Society for Prevention of Cruelty of Children. From there, in 1922, there were around 300 non-governmental child protection societies in the United States that were helping children who were being abused or neglected. In 1976 to 1987, the American Humane Association collected data, and they were able to develop the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who will make reports of child abuse and maltreatment and help with determining what type of services we have in place now to help these kiddos who are experiencing this type of abuse. So as far as in Pennsylvania, we have the Child Protective Services Law, or the CPSL. So the CPSL helps in the removal of children from homes when it is unsafe. They can give the perpetrator fines, legal time, and various different things if they are reported or if they are accused and incriminated for abusing a child. So in the state of Pennsylvania, we have mandated reporters who have to report any type of suspected abuse to government agencies, to Childline, in order to have them investigate whether or not that child is being abused. So I'm going to pause right here and do video number 2 so that I can continue. Thanks.